Picture a teenager facing life's toughest challenges, abuse, trauma, identity struggles, and finding a book that speaks directly to your heart. Imagine stories so raw and real, they mirror your experiences, offering hope and resilience while refusing to shy away from life's darker corners. These powerful works have inspired readers for decades, earning accolades like the prestigious Margaret A. Edwards Award from the ALA for Running Loose, Stotan, The Crazy Horse Electric Game, Chinese Handcuffs, Athletic Shorts, and Staying Fat for Sarah Burns. Drawing from his career as a family therapist, he continues to advocate for teens and champion intellectual freedom. Please welcome the celebrated author, ChrisCrutcher.
Good to be here.
Your books often tackle serious issues like abuse, trauma, and identity struggles. How did your experiences as a family therapist shape your understanding of these themes, and how do they influence your writing?
When I started working as a family therapist, I started to understand a lot of what I had run into when I was younger, when I was a high school kid, or even before that. That a lot of the things that were going on with the families that I was working with who were mired in the child abuse system were also things that had been going on with my friends and with people, who weren't my friends when I was growing up. And so as I started working with people and hearing their stories, I was changing my idea about what real heroism is. It's like when I'm growing up, it's Superman. And then someplace in there, you realize that Superman's not all that brave. He's bulletproof, for crying out loud. You can't hurt him. And I started to look at these people and think, boy, there are kids standing up under pressure that would have crushed me when I was growing up. And there are adults that I'm working with now who have done such heinous things to their mates or to their kids and are now willing to try to change that, which means I have to admit that that's the kind of human being I've been. Now, I ran into a lot of people who wouldn't do that. If you're going to get into that business, your success rate, if you get too much over 50%, you're pretty good. But I started looking at that, and then I thought, I wasn't as a kid, I wasn't much of a reader. We didn't have the designation in those days, but I was real ADHD. I had a real bouncy brain. I just thought I was an idiot. I couldn't concentrate on things. And so I wasn't much of a reader. I found my brother's old homework. All his book reports were in his closet. He was 2 years older than I was. I just recycled. And so there was so much that even even after I did start reading, I didn't see them being talked about in books. And back then, I mean, they're being talked about all the time now, but back then there weren't very many books like that. And I thought, boy, this is just sitting right in front of us. And what I need to do is I need to look at these human beings and understand that they're not so much different than I am. They're, in a lot of cases, it's there, but for the grace of the universe. I mean, that could have been me if I had been treated that way. And so a lot of times when I'm writing, I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna put a character in there like me who might have been treated that way. And then the story starts to rise.
In Loser's Bracket, Annie Booth struggles with her connection to both her foster family and her birth family. Why do you think it's so difficult for teens, even those from abusive homes, to sever those bonds, and what do you hope readers take away from Anne's story?
I I was amazed particularly when I started working with families, and particularly families. It wasn't just teenagers; it was families with younger kids too. And you would see these kids who had been treated horribly, but were trying to figure out some way to get back to their original family. And it became pretty clear that that they were that there's a biological piece that I might not be able to identify, and I'm not scientific enough to to get into the details of, but that it was almost always true. There would be. I remember a little kid at one point. He was 5 years old, and his sister was a little bit younger. She was four, and he was trying to get back. Trying doing everything he could to get back, and it was a family that was never going to be able to take care of him. And the little girl didn't want to go. She was just scared because she had had him to kind of, break ground for her. And at one point in a session that he was doing, he said, "I don't know why she doesn't want to go back. They didn't kill her." You thought, whoa, that's a pretty low bar. And I would start to see that over and over. And the clients closest to my heart, in fact, she doesn't have the same history, but she is the voice of the Sarah Burns character, just because she's tougher than nails. And I met her when she was 16 years old, and she was in an absolutely hopeless situation with her mom and dad. Her dad was he might have been marginally good enough to be a dad, but he was a long haul truck driver. And boy, mom could look good to the community, but she was throwing people around by their hair. She was rough. And this girl would finally have enough and she would leave, but there were younger siblings. And after a certain amount of time, she would do everything she could do to get thrown out of a really good foster home to get back into her own family where they had no place else to put her. They'd give mom one more chance. And she bounced back and forth. I mean, she and I still get together. She's 50 some years old now, but she was 16 when I met her. And that time between like 16 and 21 probably is the time that I worked most extensively with her. She bounced back and forth like a ping pong ball. And it was just all she would get so anxious, not knowing what mom was going to do or if mom were okay. And so she'd go back to check it all out, and then mom wouldn't be okay, and so she'd get bounced again. And that was to some degree. I mean, that was the model for what was going on with Annie. There's a line that's fairly close to this that I used in the book. I don't have the family that I want, but I have the family I need. And basically, she's saying, I can't have the family that I want, but at least I have the one I need. Of course, until then that family falls apart.
Humor plays a significant role in your writing, even when dealing with dark and heavy topics. How do you balance between humor and seriousness, and why is humor such an essential tool in your storytelling?
There are a couple of good answers for that, for me at least. One thing, there's very little that in the moment isn't healing about laughter. I mean, you can be in a really tough spot, but if you find something funny, there's a moment in there where it's funny, and you can't be totally laughing and totally angry at the same time. I mean, it's a respite. And one of the things that I always found with clients, both teenage clients, adult clients, little kid clients, was that if you could find where their sense of humor was, if you could find a place that they thought was, even if their situation was so god awful that it was ridiculous and so ridiculous that you had to laugh at it, boy, there was a place to start some healing. If I can find a way to say, this is so screwed up, I got to do something crazy to get out of it, or I can describe it in therapy, or I can describe it to my friends as something so ridiculous that it's funny. So that's a part of it. In the writing, for me, I mean, when I get into the really tough stuff, the humor also helps me. It's a break. One of the things from a craft point of view, I know if I give you humor, you'll let me go further into the dark, and as a reader. And I know as a writer, it's easier for me to go further into the dark if I can break it up. So there's always a character in there. When I was a kid, if somebody would ask me what I wanted to be, I wanted to be a stand-up comic. I thought that was like the best job anybody could ever have. So I had that. I mean, I thought I was a stand-up comic in class most of the time, right before I got sent to the office. And I still had a pretty good audience in the room. It's just teacher wasn't among them. But I really liked that instant response, that humorous response. If I can keep you laughing, I can probably keep you reading.
Are you saying you use humor to more engage your audience and to ease up the audience from such a dark topic?
Absolutely. And that allows you, I mean, when you're playing around with it, when you go back and do your editing, And I will actually go in and kind of place the humor when I know that whoa, I'm reading something that just, that's even rocking me. Then I know that that's a good time to give everybody a chance to take a breath. And one of the best ways to take a breath is to laugh.
Your books, including WhaleTalk, have frequently been challenged or banned for addressing mature and controversial topics. As a recipient of the 2005 Intellectual Freedom Award to National Coalition Against Censorship, how do you navigate the challenges of censorship, and what message do you have for readers and educators who are fighting to protect intellectual freedom?
I have that award, and I also have another one from the American Library Association for Intellectual Freedom. And those are probably my two most cherished, at least, awards. And I've been alive for a long time, so there's a number of pretty good ones and some really good ones. But the intellectual freedom piece, my first book, Running Loose, was banned um, in several school districts, and I grew up. My dad was a World War II bomber pilot. And by the time he was the same age I was when I was graduating from college, he had flown 35 missions over Nazi Germany, and sometimes only with a couple of engines to get back. I mean, and he came back a patriot. I mean, he was conservative in that time, and he ran for the school board. He was real bright, and he would have run a nail through his eye before he would have let a book get banned on his watch. He fought a war for that. So I grew up in a conservative family, but it was very different. And the freedom of ideas, the freedom of speech and all that, boy, that was almost like religion in our house. So the first time I got banned, and at the time my dad was still alive. I mean, we had a big laugh about that, just because of the history that I just gave you. And I started going back and looking at the things that I was being banned for. And I was being banned for telling truths that made adults uneasy. Very, very seldom did I ever get a complaint from somebody under the age of 20. But you got all kinds of, the Christian right was all over it all the time. I mean, and once you get one book banned, they're just waiting for your next book to come out. Those people know what they're doing. They don't sleep. And I started looking at the things that I was being banned for, and I started again looking at it as a badge of honor. I thought so differently than those people that in the world of literature, those people were my enemy, because I thought they were the enemy of the kids who needed to read those stories. There's an author out there, Lori Hall Sanderson. She wrote a book called Speak, and Speak is a book. It's about date rape, and it's pretty autobiographical for Lori. And she could paper any room you can imagine with emails and letters that she's received from girls, and the crux of it all is, I didn't even know it was rape until I read your book. I thought it was my fault, over and over and over again. And that books like Whale Talk that say a lot about race, books like Sarah Burns that say a lot about abuse, and I mean all of the books, cover some of those things. Over and over and over again, you get letters. And I've done school visits since 1985. I think I have almost 3 million air miles going to schools actually all over the world, but certainly all over the United States. Always a kid will come up and say, that's my life. And it'll be the interesting thing to me about it. One of the interesting things to me about it is that it'll be something that I wouldn't have expected. It would be something that I start to understand, that because that kid has a certain history, this thing that I wrote had more meaning to it than I knew when I wrote it, because of the history that kid brings. And then so the kid gets the book, and then all of a sudden the community goes crazy and wants the book taken away. The kid feels like, this community they hate this book because they hate the character that's like me. You censor the book, you censor the kid. So I always fought back, and it was kind of fun actually because it's a pretty easy argument. They don't use good sense. They use anger and they use passion. I think it's tougher for writers today. A huge number of writers from the LGBTQ community plus community are coming out with amazing books. Boy, those things are getting, they're on the radar of the censors in a second. The language is such that this stuff is evil, and that talking about race and some of the things that we've done as a society, talking about those things are evil. My best friend growing up, one of my very best friends still today, was Ron Nakatani. He's a Japanese kid. His mother was in an American concentration camp while his dad was in Germany fighting in World War II. And people don't like to talk about that kind of stuff. But I look at it and I think, boy, if you don't look at those kinds of things, then you're in trouble. And then the censors get in this place where they don't want any kind of sexual content in a book. They don't even want a teenager thinking about sex. Well, I don't know any teenagers that don't think about sex. I don't know anybody that doesn't think about sex. And if you don't put it in the story, it's not believable to the reader. So the whole purpose of writing a good story, in my mind, and I look at this the same way as a reader. The whole purpose of writing a good story is to make a connection with the reader. Your book is likely to be better than it ever had a reason to be because of the history the reader brings to the book. There's a connection that you make, even with somebody you don't know. It's a connection that you're making through your character. I mean, they don't know me, but they'll choose a situation or they'll choose a character, and it means something to them. And then the book banners come in and say they'll degrade that, and they'll dismiss it, and they'll try to embarrass you for caring, and it just causes anxiety in human beings and depression in human beings. It shouldn't be there.
So a lot of parents, the reason they decide to ban books is to more or less protect their child's innocence.
I think it's a legitimate concern on the part of those parents because the more innocent you can keep somebody, if you can keep them out of any bad situations, it's kind of a comfortable place to be. Somebody asked me this. Actually, it was a teacher asking a legitimate question. She said, I've got a niece and I've got a little girl, and I love their innocence." And I said, if you can tell me when innocence turns to ignorance, then we can talk about whether or not it's a good idea to keep a child innocent. Innocence does turn to ignorance. In other words, if I keep you from knowing what the world is like, you're not going to be able to deal in the world. And the reality is a lot of people who think their kids are innocent of, situations or thoughts, things like it, they aren't. They get it at school. It's all around them. I mean, most kids don't even get it from books. It's all over the internet. It's everywhere. The communication the way it is today, you'd have to keep your kid in a cage for them not to know those things that make you feel uneasy. So to want to keep somebody innocent, that's a nice thought, but number one, it can't be done, and number two, I think it's dangerous because you leave a kid in a place where they don't know what the world is really like. It'd be so much better to say, if I would say, if you want to ban a book, mine or anybody else's, instead of banning the book, sit down and read the book with your kid and tell them why you think Chris Crutcher is a beast, or tell them why you think this author sucks. You go ahead and give them your opinion, but let them give you theirs.
You're saying
All
let
of a
them give
sudden
you a chance?
yeah, give yourself a chance to explain to them why you think the way you think. Give them the chance to tell you how they think.
You're working on a nonfiction book, Stotanic Verses, about real people who stood up under pressure. What inspired this project, and how does it connect to themes of resilience and bravery in your fiction? Do you see it as a way to celebrate the diversity of courage and the unique challenges faced by different communities?
That's a real good way to put it. I do see it that way, and I see it. I go back and a lot of times when you're doing school visits or when you're doing a convention or a conference, a national one or a state one or something like that, you're reading from books. You're reading from what you wrote, and that's part of the discussion. And in doing that, I started looking back on it. At some point, I started thinking, well, where did all this come from? Because there's so much in there that I wouldn't have known had I not worked in that world, or if I just hadn't been alive for a long time. Particularly if it comes from if it comes from the world of abuse and neglect, or my therapeutic life, I had to get permission. It seems so important to tell the real stories. Number one, it authenticates what you've written in fiction. But in many cases, uh, some of the things that I wrote in fiction, I edited a lot of stuff out of the lives of the situations and the people that I was kind of portraying, because sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. So the idea behind this is to say, so many of those people that I worked with need a voice, because if you get into if you get into those really really difficult situations, you don't have much of a voice. You're using all your energy just to keep afloat. And so you very often look like, you appear to be an undesirable human being, when in fact, you're probably as brave as anybody you run into, because you're still out there working. So I thought it was a good idea to just talk about where all that stuff came from, because it's a 40-year writing career, more than that, I guess. Damn, I'm getting old.
I mean, that kind of leads into my next question. After decades of storytelling, working as a therapist, and advocacy, if you could write a letter to your younger self as a teenager, what would you say and what lessons would you share that you've only learned through living and writing?
Boy, that's a good question. The first thing I would do, I don't know how this could have been received. The first thing I would do is I'd go back and I would tell that younger me that the way I thought was a way of thinking. It wasn't ignorance. The fact that I couldn't concentrate on things, um, and the feeling that I had of being less than, not smart enough, those kinds of things. I wasn't having a tough life. I was popular and all that, but I cheated through high school like a Mississippi riverboat gambler. If I could figure out some way to get through an assignment without actually doing the assignment, I did it, and I was pretty darn good at it. What that did to me was it prevented me from reading good stories. I didn't read good stories. I read book reports. I read short things about stories. So when I finally figured out that I knew a little more how my mind worked, and that I could navigate that. It took me till I was 35 to write the first book, because I had to go back and read a bunch of books, for one thing. I mean, I read books that you probably read now when I was like in my 20s or 30s. So I would just give myself that advice. But the other thing that would have helped me as a human being back then, and that probably would have informed my writing career, is that I would write myself and I would say, you better understand that everybody has a story. And if you knew their story, you treat them with far greater respect. Because you get in high school, and I grew up in a real small town, fewer than 1,000 people. That we had my graduating class, like 15, I guess. Two of them were sent down from the year before. But there were still cliques, and there were the cool guys, those guys, we played sports, all those kinds of things. And then there were these people that you didn't want to hang around, or your parents didn't want you to hang around. You thought they were the tough guys. They were kids just trying to make their way. You didn't give them much room, and you were quick to humiliate. My first 10 years out of college, I worked before I was a therapist. I worked as a teacher and then director in an alternative school in Oakland, California. All kids that were being thrown out of public school, K through 12. And as I did that job, I started to realize, boy, there were a whole bunch of kids that I grew up with that had lives that were tough, like these kids' lives. But I didn't know it. And we didn't have an alternative school. We didn't have any of that. We just gave those kids a hard time. So I would go back and say, you wake up, because, I mean, adolescence is tough enough to manage. You don't need your peers ganging up on you. So I think those are the two things that I'd really give myself, and I do it in reverse order. I do that part first, then I'd tell myself I wasn't as dumb as I thought I was.
ChrisCrutcher's stories shine a light on the resilience of the human spirit, the power of humor in dark times, and the importance of speaking truth, even when it's uncomfortable. His work has inspired countless readers to confront life's challenges with courage and compassion. Thank you for continuing to tell the stories that matter and for championing the freedom to read. We can't wait to experience your next chapter.
It's coming up soon, and I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate your presentation of me.